Hello and welcome to another episode of Consoletronix. My name is Gray, and while some of you may recognise the name of the subject of today's video, I guarantee that all of you have heard of the company he both founded and turned into the dominant pre-Nintendo gaming powerhouse, Atari. The beginnings of the history of video games was largely written within the four walls of their Silicon Valley HQ. But what made Atari unique was its diversity of interests. Not content with popularising and cementing video games in the home with the 2600, releasing for their day some of the most technically daring arcade machines, but also playing a leading role in the increasingly important home computer market of the 1980s. First with 8 bits like the 400, 800 and XL, XE ranges, but also 16 bits with the ST, whose rivalry with Commodore's Amiga platform, more so in Europe than both companies' native America weirdly, makes the PlayStation and Xbox fanboys of today look like amateurs. But as interesting as a complete history of Atari will be in a future video, right now I want to bring the focus onto the man directly behind it, Nolan Bushnell, who together with friend and fellow future shaper of the then embryonic home electronics market, Ted Dabney, founded Atari in Sunnyvale, California in 1972. The name meaning checkmate in the Japanese tile game of Go, which they both enjoyed. Atari was conceived with the idea that there would be a paying market for video game entertainment in bars, restaurants and other establishments. In this, they had some first-hand experience. Nolan had played what is considered the very first computer game, Space War, at college, and knew that a simpler, accessible version had commercial potential. And previous to starting Atari had done just that by releasing a Space War clone called Computer Space through a small pinball distributor named Nutting, which ironically is what Bushnell would financially get out of this partnership. But he saw enough in the limited sales of Computer Space that an untapped market with quarters in their pockets was waiting for something new. The first hurdle to overcome though was the indifference of owners of anywhere he approached looking to sell his arcades. It wasn't just the novelty of the new technology, but many feared that it would increase vandalism as people would try to steal the TV sets out of the cabinets. Undeterred, Bushnell, after severing all ties with partner Ted Dabney, would, with the help of programmer Alan Alcorn, develop one of the first and most recognisable commercially available video games, Pong. An instant hit upon release, video games had arrived. And this time, the genie could not be put back into the bottle. Atari would, by the mid-1970s, be one of the leading and most recognisable brands within this new industry. But Bushnell's ambition and restless energy meant that it wasn't enough to simply follow up the success of Pong, which Atari did with huge success. Titles like Tank, Quack, Super Pong, amongst others, all contributed to the considerable growth of the company. But Bushnell already had his sights set on another virgin marketplace, the home. In 1975, the first attempt was made with a home Pong console, but 2 years later in 1977, history was made a second time as Atari released what was originally branded the Atari Video Computer System, or VCS, which would later come to be known as the 2600. This changed everything, and despite the high costs, it became a necessity for the first generation of gamers. Despite not being the first cartridge-based console, it would not only outsell its competition, but through many variants would outlast even the NES, not ceasing production until 1992, but continually sold after that time with various amounts of games, well into the 2000s. By the late 1970s, however, the success Atari enjoyed did not go unnoticed by the big boys of the business world, and prior to the release of the VCS, Atari was sold for a cool $30 million to Warner Brothers. And as the decade began to close, Atari would account for close to 50% of the total profits of Warner Brothers. But despite the success, this was not a happy marriage. Atari had been a fairly liberal working environment, particularly in the early days, with lots of female workers involved in different capacities. Even then, the image of the spectacled geek tinkering on his circuit boards was being challenged. But as is always the case when new industries get swallowed up by the more traditional and rigid practices of the corporate world, a clash of cultures ensued. Bushnell, wanting to replace the selling by the truckload 2600 with a newer and more powerful replacement almost as quickly as he got it to market, was quickly put in his place by the Warner's board, who wanted to milk the success of the console for as long as possible. And at around this time also, one of the greatest what might have beens in entertainment history took place, as two Californian hippies with an interest in electronics, who happened to be working at Atari at the time, developed in the garage of a friend a prototype computer they called the Apple I. Their names were Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and if things had worked out differently, it could well have been Atari who brought the Apple II to market. And who knows, maybe the Atari Macintosh would have appeared in 1985, or perhaps even the Atari iPod in 2001. This is what Bushnell envisioned in those days, Atari at the forefront of not just games, but of technology itself. But even at the peak of his powers in 1978, Bushnell's reign at Atari was cut short. Simmering tensions between himself and Warner's finally boiled over, and Bushnell was relieved of his duties as head of Atari. One of the conditions of his departure was to sign a legally binding document that prohibited his involvement in video games or in any capacity that could rival Atari. Bushnell signed, and leaving the industry he had largely created, would turn his passion and energy into a business venture that had been on his mind for years. He opened Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Parlours, featuring animatronic entertainment to complement the arcade machines you could play while enjoying your food. Now, I couldn't tell you whether Chuck E. Cheese ever had any restaurants over here in the UK or anywhere in Europe. I certainly never saw any, and have only ever heard the name in American TV shows or movies. But after establishing this franchise, he would leave to pursue other interests in a wide range of genres, most involved in some way with new technologies. But it's his days at Atari and the pioneering work that others would build upon to create the video game industry of today that he will always be remembered, regardless of what fucking feminists say. So there we have it, folks. This has been my first episode of what I hope will be an ongoing fixture here on Consoletronix, and episode 2 of Video Game Pioneers will be dedicated to one of the greatest Japanese developers of all time. So I hope you enjoyed. Please like, share, leave a comment and subscribe. My name's Gray, thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.